The title of my book is The Narcissism of Minor Differences, which is an attempt precisely to borrow Freud's famous phrase to show that although these differences aren't actually very big, we spend an awful lot of time worrying and fretting about them and parsing out the differences that we think separate us. So we have a significant fraction of the population that isn't covered by any legally binding form of health insurance. Now, you would expect that that would lead to outcomes that are, in a sense, dysfunctional or unfavorable, that the health state of the American population would be worse than that of those of Europe. But if you look at the other outcomes, in other words, if you look at incidence, at mortality, at days and years of life lost to various diseases, and you plot that against the European results, the surprising outcome is that in almost every case, the American results are at least as good as the European average, and in many respects, they're at the top of the European scale. We are relatively inefficient consumers of energy in an industrial sense, but again, compared to some European nations, we fall within the spectrum. If you look at oil consumption per capita, we are at the high end of we're off the European scale at the high end. But if you graph the same oil consumption as a function of GDP, in other words, if you look at the input that's necessary to produce the economic output, and you put those two in relation to each other, we're toward the high end of the European spectrum, but not in any sense off it. We actually have a rather well-developed train system. Nobody really knows about it, and it's true that we don't use it for passenger use, but it's what transports a large fraction of our freight. And compared to European train systems, a much greater percentage of our freight travels by rail than is the case in Europe. And in this case, it seems that the Europeans tend to have their passengers go virtuously by rail, while their cornflakes and their mail and their breakfast cereals and all the other things, their freight goes by truck, whereas in America we tend to do it the other way around. And I've seen lots of examples where people have said that on the basis of some little snippet of data, they knew that there really was a huge unbridgeable chasm that sort of runs down the middle of the Atlantic. And it always struck me that if you actually knew what the data from the various European countries was, that it was often not nearly as dramatic as it was supposed.